So you may have got to a point where you're happy with what you've produced, or you may want to develop it further. And one of the ways you can develop it further is to add some drips. So this is only for the brave. If you're not feeling brave, you don't necessarily have to do this. So this is the yellow that I had in my palette earlier. I've added a wee bit of water just to dilute it slightly. And I'm going to take my board and I'm going to lay a tiny thin strip of this at the top of my piece. It's got to be quite wet because we need to start those drips off, and then I'm going to stand it up so that gravity can do its thing. And there's a number of ways you can do this. You can just keep adding that really wet strip of watercolour at the top and start to wait for it to drip. And depending upon how big and sort of porous your brush is, the amount of water it holds, you're going to get sort of different types of drips. So for example, if I used a large mop brush like so, which has a much larger head to it, then I'm going to get larger drips that are more readily going to come from the top. So for me that's actually working slightly better. Now if you are doing this, make sure that you're working on a table or something which doesn't matter when the drips collect. So that's sort of activated quite nicely. And I'm going to just mop up my drips. And I'm going to lay my work back down again. I don't know how well the camera actually picks that up, but I can see just sort of very subtle drips there. And I'm going to take my yellow again and just put it at the top. Otherwise it looks like the drips have kind of come from nowhere. And if you're not sure about doing this, if you make quite a dilute mixture of the yellow, then you'll get a very subtle effect. You might want to be really bold and do this with a much darker colour, but I've just chosen to sort of go in quite gingerly to start with. Just give that another go. And then just mop up my drips and lay my work back down. And if I bring this up closer to the camera, I don't know whether you can see, there's just some very subtle lines there, which just gives it another dimension so that we don't just have those kind of drips and splatters. And if you wanted to, you could carry on doing that in different colours. So for example, you could, I wouldn't suggest doing it with very, very bold colours, but something like this ochre colour, and particularly if you watered it down again, we could have a bit of a go with that. What I might do though is to not lay it all the way along, but perhaps just to lay it in parts and then to just drip down. It's almost like a sort of tea stain effect, because that's the kind of colour that it's sort of showing on the work. So if you want it to look slightly bolder, and again if you wanted to have sort of more of an effect at the top of that colour, you can just lay it in. And this might not be for you, it might not be your cup of tea, and you might want to just leave things as they were with the drips, sorry, with the splatters rather than using the drips. But if you want to add something else to your work, then you can. And sometimes these drips sort of give a nice framing effect to your work. Because they're running vertically, they lead the eye in a different way around the composition. So I'll just show you, you can probably see a bit more clearly now. So there you go. So we've looked at quite a few different techniques today. We haven't done anything too wild in terms of wet in wet painting. There's lots of ways we could have done this, and I could always have put down a wet and wet background whereby we saw less of the paper surface showing through. We perhaps did a dark colour at the bottom, and then we sprayed the paper and perhaps put dishwasher salt and got quite experimental. But as this may be some people's first time with watercolour, I thought I'd just keep it simple. The principle of watercolour is that it is a transparent medium, and so it's nice to see some of the paper underneath showing through. I've applied quite thickly on the seed heads, so there is more of a sort of opacity to the way that that looks, because it's quite thick and it's kind of mottled and there's some layers in there. But with the background, there's a contrast because it's quite transparent. So it's using the natural properties of the watercolour to allow that substrate to just shine through, and then we're not having too distracting a background with our foreground of the poppy seeds. So hopefully you've learnt a few more techniques today for watercolour, or if it's your first time, hopefully you've learnt a few of the basic guiding principles and it's not been too difficult or too intimidating. And I hope you enjoyed the lesson. Do feel free to post your work, and I will see you next time.